Hello, APUSH history. Just want to tune in with all of you for our third week here of class together in the online setting. I want to just take time to talk through a little bit of the dynamics of period 8 with you, so that hopefully I can kind of drive home a couple things and just talk through what makes period 8 what it is in the 1945 to 1980 timeframe. There's not really anything I'm going to say in this video that's not found in those period 8 concept map notes that I sent back to you 2 weeks ago. So let that be the reminder on if you haven't gotten those down yet at this point, you need to get those down by the end of this week, because then we're going to kind of move on from what we're trying to focus on with those. Period 8, as far as the political practices, the legislation, the different things put in place by the different presidential administrations of period 8, which are some of the things that you've been writing down in those presidential administration notes I sent you last week, gives rise to what we would call a rise or like an era of liberalism in American politics in period 8. Now, just to kind of remind all of us, when we say liberalism and we say conservatism in American politics, think just generally liberal means more government involvement and conservative means less government involvement, more of a hands-off government the more conservative you get. And in period 8, we see the things government is involved in gets deeper, more numerous, more significant in period 8. And some are in ways that are necessary, things that I think we would say, of course, like we're glad government got involved. All of last week, you spent time going through different civil rights focused sources. And as far as government actually changing or amending, we should say, the Constitution and putting laws in place that are all guaranteeing equality of civil rights and protection of those civil rights for all citizens, regardless of sex, race, background, etc., are things that we're all glad that the government stepped in to actually do something about at the federal level. That being said, period 8 shows us a little bit of the concern about if government starts being involved in too many things or doing too much, it gets hard for government to do anything well. And that's a little bit of what we see in period 8. One of the things you're all going to do this week is dive through some political cartoons that are detailing different views and images for thoughts on U.S. involvement in the Cold War, in the Korean War, in the Vietnam War, and how the U.S. really is putting these different presidential doctrines into practice of trying to actually go out into the world, whether it's early on just to be able to then help nations to then create a buffer and containment zone against Soviets and Chinese spreading communism, or after a while, it just becomes wanting to help nations that are considered third world, basically like deciding between like democratic capitalism and like a more of like a Soviet communism style. These nations that are on the in-between and trying to influence them to join the democratic capitalist side, but then also being indebted to the US. It's kind of a way in which the US really becomes a quasi-imperialist nation. By that I mean having colonies. And when I say quasi, I mean not actual official colonies, although we do get a couple. We mean it more as nations that then you let do their own thing, that then look back to the US and say, we love you for helping us get this type of a nation. So some of the major areas we see a rise and solidification of liberalism in period 8 is the clearest example is through LBJ's Great Society legislation, which you all looked at last week, some of the laws that are there. Laws that are meant to be able to have economic support for people who are unemployed, people who are unable to work for a little while, having there be protection for voting, to try to do away with any type of poll tax or voting discrimination or anything of any kind, so that any citizen is able to actually use their right to vote. when government is getting involved in all these areas, a reality of that is that it's expensive. It's expensive for government to have economic support for low-income or unemployed people. And again, you can argue that that's like a good thing for government to do if that's the way that your political mindset is geared towards. But the reality is it costs money. If government is going to be setting up agencies to regulate voting to make sure that voting is happening and no voter discrimination is happening, and that there aren't states or cities or towns that are just doing their own thing and refusing the right to vote to certain types of people, we have to pay people salaries to go handle those inquiries, to go investigate those aspects. So the more involved government gets, the more expensive it is to run government. Now, Great Society, if you look through some of those programs for Great Society and you thought, well, I like the idea of government supporting people in these kinds of ways, and you're hearing what I'm saying now, which is, but it gets expensive. There's some level in which the Great Society programs, certainly you could make the argument that they're possible, doable, and could be helpful, but they're only helpful if you have full resources ready to pay for all those things. And here's the problem of what happens with the US during this time. Through this rise of liberalism in American society, but then also this idea of global liberalism, of US being involved all over the world to be able to try to promote, support, maintain democratic capitalist nations across the nation, or across the globe, the US gets involved in all of these different places. All of the places listed in the PowerPoint I sent out to you guys last week, in some major conflicts in Korea and in Vietnam. Vietnam in particular becomes this, what's the best wording to use? It's a bit of like a quicksand type scenario that the US finds itself in. The US gets stuck in what seems to be kind of an endless, winless conflict in Vietnam, which, again, the argument can be made that the US didn't have a reason to really be there in the first place, other than just to try to stop the spread of, in that instance, Chinese communism. The US gets involved in Vietnam, which becomes an incredibly expensive venture for the US from a money standpoint. Also then becomes even more importantly expensive in terms of actual loss of life of American soldiers and soldiers of the other nations that are involved as well. And so with that, because the US is trying to put Great Society legislation in place and maintain a war effort in Vietnam at the same time, it isn't able to do either of them well. It isn't able to have the full funding for either. The US really ends up kind of prioritizing money towards the war more than they prioritize it towards the social programs in Great Society. There's a political cartoon. I didn't include it, just the image of it is a little bit strange, but you can look it up. There's an image in which Lyndon B. Johnson has two women on either side of him. And one woman is like decked out in fancy clothes and regalia, and she's got this sash that says Vietnam War. And then there's another woman to his side who looks like she hasn't eaten in weeks. And I believe, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, it says like either domestic issues or unemployed American or something, just suggesting that she's representing the issues of the nation inside the nation. And LBJ looks at her and says, I promise you there's enough money in the nation to support both of you. Doesn't that make you feel better? And you can clearly see by how they're depicted that the one woman has all this fancy stuff, as clearly that's where the money's going, and the other one barely has enough to survive. And that's a good depiction of kind of this time period. The US is it's extending itself in so many different places around the world, most notably and visibly Korea and Vietnam, but in a lot of other areas as well. And that gets expensive. And in being so globally attached out in other places in the world, the US loses the ability to really kind of regulate and monitor its own issues, its own society. Some of the laws we see passed in Period 8 sound good in theory, but they can't be applied if there's no resources or government really available to actually make sure that they work. It's in this government inefficiency and trying to do too many things That's going to lead us to what we're going to call a rise of conservatism in period 9. That's reflected in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. That's kind of our preview for our next unit of focus as we kind of keep going through periods 8 and 9. Just as a reminder too, we are condensing our periods 8 and 9 study. Again, I still want to make sure that I'm hitting some major aspects of US history with all of you, but knowing that the AP exam is going to focus on periods 1 through 7, we want to make sure we hit some essentials in these 2 units so then that we can take some time and free up some time to really dive in and go deep into periods 1 through 7 to get you as ready as possible for that AP exam. That's it. Again, US extending itself in too many places, both internationally as well as then trying to do too many things domestically, all in a 20-year stretch of time, leads to an inefficient and ineffective US government that leads the American people towards wanting less government and less involvement in things. Just kind of the seesaw of society of the time. And that's a bit of a period 8 overview in calling it an era of liberalism for US politics and government. And I think that's all I've got. So blessings on your week and blessings on all your activities for this class. See you online.